So first off, my name is Dave McCarthy. I work at Bsquare Corporation, and I've spent the last couple of years out trying to understand, what are some of the business challenges that companies face when implementing IoT. I think that we all realize that it's a very popular term now, and certainly everybody feels like, as has been mentioned before, certainly today, that an IoT strategy is important for every company going forward. But what does that really mean? And so I want to share a couple of views of where I think the market is and where I think things are and where things are going. Talk about some industries and what I've seen companies doing and the types of things that companies can benefit from in an IoT environment. And then share with you some ideas that I think are necessary to truly implement a business-focused IoT system. So first off, the reason I think why we're all interested in IoT is it's a very big market. And I threw a few different analysts and company sort of predictions out there. And you can tell just by the numbers on the screen, I mean, whether you believe the 1.7 million or 7 trillion number or the 11 trillion number or even the 19 trillion number, it goes up and down depending on how you look at it. What's interesting to me is IDC was probably the one company up here that's actually ratcheted down a little bit their estimate. But two things come of this. One, I think that everybody recognizes that this is a new source of value for companies and value in the industry. I think what it also shows is that things are still not very mature. I mean, there's no way that analysts who get paid for a living could be this far off if it was that easy to measure. So to me, that means that things are still forming. And I think that that's, again, part of the challenge of what IoT is and what IoT means. So if you look back at the markets. So here was IDC's map of the IoT market from last year. And as you can tell, there's just a smattering of companies spreading across all sorts of different parts of computing. And so the question is this IoT? And if I was a company trying to implement it, what would I do? Would I go and call each one of these companies up and say, you must have one piece of the puzzle that's required for IoT? Or would I go and try to investigate the open source community and figure out what I could do there? I think that the reality is it's confusing out there in terms of what it is. And unfortunately, this isn't really getting any better. If anything, it's actually getting a little worse. Trying to there you go. It's even worse. So if you thought the last slide was a big confusing slide, this one is even more confusing. And I admit it's hard to read, and it's purposely put up there for a reason. I mean, the fact is, more and more people are throwing the term IoT around and trying to understand, what it means and what it does. And so again, this idea that it's not clear for businesses in terms of how they can generate value from this and what they should do and what's the roadmap of even doing this. So. Gartner puts together all the time their hype curves. And so I call this the IoT maturity cycle, but to me this also speaks to where things are. And so if you've never actually looked at one of these before, Gartner puts together 5 different categories of phases that technology goes through. And if you look at it, I actually stripped off a lot of the things I didn't think were so relevant, but right at the top of that curve is Internet of Things. Now, of course, that particular sliver, if you look at it, is called the inflated expectation peak. And I think that we could all feel like that's where it is. I mean, everybody's talking about it. It's an exciting new thing. We all want to jump on board. Expectations are high. Unfortunately, guess what happens right after you hit that peak? You fall into this wonderful world of the trough of disillusionment. I love that term, but I think it's fair to say that companies that have gone down IoT initially may have already found themselves in that position where they have gone and they've done some things that feel a little bit IoT-like, and they're saying to ourselves, what did I get out of it? What was the value? Did I get any sort of return on investment? Was this an interesting science experiment, or was this something that really helped my business? Now, the other thing that's interesting on here is if you look at some of the things like asset performance management, to me, now that's a use case that IoT helps enable. Now that is actually coming off the curve, and I bet if we looked at some more recent research from Gartner at this point, they'd probably show it kind of going up into that slope of enlightenment, meaning that companies are starting to transition from trying to figure out what it is and trying to do something about it. Last year I was here and I watched a presenter on the stage talk about cloud, and they said, 5 years ago we were sitting at this very same conference trying to figure out what the cloud means, because if you talk to 10 different people, you'd get 10 different answers. Certainly 5 or 6 years ago you did. Nowadays, those conversations have transitioned. Now we're talking about real solutions with the cloud and real value and all of those sorts of things. And I feel like we're getting to that point with IoT. Is it there yet? Hard to say. But are we starting to fight a little bit less about defining things and really start talking about value and things that we can get out of it? I think so. And I'm going to go through some examples next of industries that I've been talking to personally that are starting to see the value of IoT and understanding what it might mean for them. So this gets us back to what is the goal of IoT. Sort of like with the cloud and saying there's 10 different answers for cloud, there's 10 different answers of IoT. And so I want to frame up a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about IoT. So for me, the time that I spend is not on the consumer side of IoT. In fact, you could probably arguably say that the consumer IoT is out front. You're seeing whether we want to look at things like wearables or smart home automation and all those sorts of things. You're seeing real traction in the market, real excitement, some things happening. But you're not seeing that on the business side. Why is that? If you look at the McKinsey report that I referenced earlier, they've come out and say that 70% of the value that's going to be coming from IoT solutions will really be on the business side. So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk not focusing on the consumer part of IoT, but really focusing on the business side. So for example, what is the goal of business-oriented IoT? And that's what we're going to focus by start going into some specific industry examples. The construction industry. So this is interesting. You go talk to a construction guy, or a guy, I shouldn't say a construction guy as much as I would say even the OEMs that are building construction equipment, and they don't think of those as things. They think of them as expensive assets that drive real value. They're revenue generating. So for them, they're not necessarily so familiar or so happy about using the term IoT. They feel like it minimizes their situation. But if you can get them over that and start saying, what do you want to do with these? Things like uptime is incredibly important for these guys. If that machine isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, then that means loss of revenue for the company, delay of projects, and lots of other sort of downstream effects in the supply chain. And the other thing I learned in some of these construction projects is that not everybody, or in fact most people who do construction projects don't actually own the construction equipment. So in fact, if you're going to go build a new overpass for the 101, you wouldn't go and buy a bunch of equipment that looks like that. You'd go to a rental company and purchase whatever or rent whatever you needed. Now, when you do that, now you're starting to talk about things like rental agreements, and all of those rental agreements have different sorts of business compliance policies on them, like you can only use the equipment a certain amount of hours per day, or you're only allowed to use it for particular uses, or it's allowed to be run on this job site but not that job site. How do the rental companies know? And in fact, today they don't. And so for them, being able to look at something like getting information off the machine that helps them understand whether or not the people that are leasing their equipment are actually using them in the way that they contracted to do so is of great value for them. Trucking. I've actually spent a bunch of time talking to trucking companies, and again, if you think about these as revenue generating assets, trucks are interesting to me because in some respects it's easy for us to marginalize them. They're like a really big car, or they're like, I've got a Ford F-150, so this is just like the super size of the Ford F-150. But of course, if you talk to a trucking guy, he would say that you're absolutely wrong. There's lots of very unique things within the trucking industry. And in fact, under the hood, these are incredibly complex machines. But again, they suffer from some of the same problem. Visibility into the world of the data that's on those devices is not available to them. And so, if you think about, the driver that's driving that truck down the road, believe it or not, they get the same thing that we get in our cars. They get a check engine light, if you will. Typically, they've got 3 of them, so they've got 2 more than we have. But they're equally not helpful as far as what does it really mean. when your check engine light goes on in your car, you don't know if that just means that, you got a bad muffler or your engine's about to explode. You just know that something is going on. And that's the exact same case for these guys. Now, the difference for them is typically for us, we're not trying to generate revenue from those vehicles, but the trucking guys are. And the other problem is, when a truck goes offline and has to go in for service, it's typically not a one-day turnaround of bring it in the morning and get it resolved at the end of the day. It's more like a week of it being offline. And if you look at the average sort of revenue generation of a truck, it's about $5,000 a day, and you start counting up that, not to mention all the time lost in, trying to repair and find parts, and how do you deliver the customer load. It's very easy to see that there's, a lot of problems that come into play if you don't have the ability to make things better. Not to mention there's another player in this, which is the truck OEM itself. I mean, they suffer from all of these situations. So if it takes, a service center 4 hours to do a diagnostic report on the truck after it finally comes in and they plug in their thing and they start looking at it, that's 4 hours of diagnostic time that they have to pay for as part of a warranty expense. Why not enable the capability of doing all that diagnostic work while the truck is still driving down the road? Not only would you be able to be smarter about whether or not it was safe to deliver your load or whether to pull over, but you would improve every business outcome along the way in that change. Energy. It's interesting to me that, energy companies and in a lot of cases, power and water get put together in sort of a similar category when it comes to things, probably because in many cases they're talking about managing, natural resources and finite resources. But all of these guys are under pressure to deliver more with what they already have. It's an optimization play. California water problem, it's tough. And yet you read all the time about how water is being wasted, or that the water utilities don't really know what's going on. And sure, they're starting to make some progress in terms of being able to put sensors and get some information, but just not nearly enough. You look at a wind farm like this, and you think about the difference between, just sort of positioning these turbines in such a way that you get the maximum amount of energy. But in none of these situations is it really like a set and forget. In fact, if you set and forget, typically you're leaving money on the table because, the world doesn't work that way. The world is constant and dynamically changing. And so why shouldn't the equipment that you're putting out in the field also be constantly changing as well to adapt to these sorts of conditions? Oil and gas. You look at that McKinsey report again, oil and gas. So McKinsey says in some of the companies that they talk to that an average oil rig has 30,000 data points. 30,000 data points. Guess how many of those they're actually taking advantage of today? 1%. And if you dig in a little bit deeper there, it's not just that they're only using 1% of that data, but it's how they're using that data. They're using 1% of that data really just to do controls and maybe some anomaly detection, but they're not going any further. They're not going into the types of things that we hear about in IoT, whether it's predictive maintenance or more advanced optimization. It's just another area, not to mention safety. I mean, think about the BP disaster that happened in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, who wouldn't believe that there wasn't something there to help, prevent that tragedy, or at least provide some sort of early warning, whether it's for the environment or for the people. It doesn't really matter. The point is, technology is available to help solve these problems, but businesses are still struggling on trying to figure out how to overcome that. Logistics and shipping. I think we've all gotten used to things like tracking numbers. In fact, now whenever I order anything, I feel like I always have instant access as to where it is. It always makes me feel good that it's not a mystery anymore. Order something and hope it shows up 3 weeks later. You can kind of find out whether it's lost or whatever. But that's not the only thing that these companies are worried about. I mean, certainly I care about that in terms of getting my package delivered on time, but they care about things like theft and intrusion detection and the integrity of the cargo, whether it's because of shock damage or temperature damage. And today, in a lot of these situations, they don't find out what happens until the container arrives on the other side and they open it up and they see what's inside. Gosh, that seems like a waste to me. I mean, these companies should be able to take advantage of real-time understanding of what's happening from a liability perspective. You know, typically in a transportation logistics situation, I mean, it's not one company that handles your cargo from point A to point B. It's a series of companies. And so when something does get damaged, how do you trace back that liability? How do you understand that, you know, that particular device ran into a problem at this time in this particular place, so on and so forth. I mean, it's that sort of real-time visibility into what's going on. I think that's really important. It's making people excited. Retail. Now, this is a place, I think, where you're seeing a lot of uptake of IoT in retail. Lots of companies putting a lot of effort into things like, how do I map out the space within a retail location? You know, how do I understand, you know, where shoppers are going? We saw some demos earlier about how you could present things like contextual advertising and promotion, get people to go to where you want to go. I'm excited about that. There are lots of good things. But that's all, in my mind, front office stuff. What about all the back office part of a retail operation? What about all that digital signage that needs to be displayed for all that to work? What about point of sales machines? How often have you ever gone to a place and they say, well, my credit card machine's broken, so now you got to go pull out the old carbon swiper, and 2 days later somebody stole your credit card because they didn't take good care of that credit card information. I mean, there's lots of underlying infrastructure that falls into, you know, what supports a retail operation. And I think that those are all growth opportunities for what IoT can do. So that's my long way of getting around and hopefully trying to stitch together some themes around why do we care about business? Why do we care about IoT? Why do we care about business-oriented IoT? It's all about improving business outcomes. It's about finding the use case that's important to you. And I absolutely agree with the fact that for businesses to be successful, for this momentum to continue, for us to get to that tipping point of actual deployments, we actually do need to defocus the technology a little bit. You know, again, you go back to those early slides with the big ecosystem of all these technology partners out there, all which play a piece in what's required for that. It's overwhelming for a company to figure out what that means. Not to mention that these companies are also struggling a little bit with the fact of, you know, now they're trying to deploy a system that's really affecting the lifeblood of their company, so the data in which they operate and what they find more valuable. In fact, probably more valuable than the so-called things themselves in a lot of ways. I mean, I think about my iPhone and the fact in a year from now I'll get a new iPhone and I won't care about this one anymore, but I guarantee you the first thing I care about when I get that new iPhone is my data. And it's really no different for companies themselves. And so if you think about those different industry cases and the things that I pointed out, they do sort of fall into these 5 major categories of areas. So this idea of increasing uptime, and so many ways of increasing uptime, whether you want to look at it from that remote diagnostics, how can we reduce troubleshooting time as a way of increasing uptime, whether it's the predictive portion of things, you know, understand leading indicators to a failure before it happens and be able to take action, or if nothing else, you know, schedule downtime at a point where it's best for the business instead of it being a disruption to whatever is going on. Talked about that OEM side of the equation of how do you manage warranty costs. You know, the reality is, you know, whether it's, you know, the consumer electronics or big equipment, these things are becoming more and more complicated, not less complicated. And because of that, you know, warranty and support liability becomes higher and higher to be able to bring all of this new technology and features out in the market. And so companies are looking for ways to reduce those warranty costs. Product differentiation. So I spoke with a company that did commercial kitchen equipment. I actually have 2 examples here. So one was commercial kitchen equipment, and they said, you know, gosh, you know, we used to be a leader in our space, but now we're starting to feel more like a commodity. I heard it with them. I also heard it in a company that does smart meters, you know, like the electric meters that would go on the side of your house. A company that said, you know, same sort of story. You know, how do we compete against low-cost entries into the market? You know, other people that are saying, well, we can deliver the same thing for less. IoT is a way of building product differentiation. Now, whether you want to look at that in terms of providing more value to the customer for the same amount of money, or whether you want to look at it from a way of unlocking some different business models, the ways of doing things, like a service. If I go back to that trucking example, well, of course that trucking company provides a warranty and an extended warranty and all those sorts of things. But what if, to you as the end consumer, they could say, well, for a particular fee per month, we're going to guarantee the uptime of that truck within a particular SLA. They never would have wanted to do that in the past. That would have been the scariest proposition in the world, because how could they have ever guaranteed that it would have made sense for their business? Having access to that data and being able to take advantage of it is a huge difference for them. And to me, I think this also sort of maps into the idea of why IoT is different and why we need to think a little bit differently about it. I mean, businesses have been investing over the last few years a lot of money into big data. And I believe that IoT is actually a component of the big data initiative. It's just a different type of data. I mean, so, a few years ago when companies came in and started realizing the fact that there was just, mounds and mounds of data collecting in back office systems, whether it was on premise or in the cloud, and weren't really taking advantage of those insights. And so you started seeing all the talk about how do I generate insights from my business data. And we've seen great progress in that area. The missing piece was the device data. And if you really think about where data generation is going moving forward, all that human data that was locked up in those enterprise systems is going to continue to grow at a much lower rate. I mean, as a human, I can only generate so much data in a particular day, no matter how hard I try. But machines, whether they're big machines or little machines, are really the next source of explosive data. And that shouldn't really be a surprise. We see it already. And the fact that, the challenges that people are running into now is, how do I manage this growing and exponentially changing and diverse and complex set of data in a way that acts and behaves differently than my enterprise data? And my proposition is, these aren't two separate worlds. Well, they might feel like two separate worlds today, but to really live the dream of IoT, it's really about bridging a gap between those two worlds, making your device data and making your enterprise data work together to unlock these new business outcomes. So there's a bunch of talk about business. Now, I figured I wouldn't be able to get off stage if I didn't try to map out a little bit of how you do it. So if you think back to those early slides with lots of different people working in lots of different areas, I think that that's part of the problem that companies run into, is they don't really understand what are the components that they would need to really deploy an effective IoT solution. So I put up here what I'm calling the complete IoT stack. In my mind, these are the three major areas that people need to think about and have solutions for in order to deliver that end-to-end complete IoT solution. So starting at the bottom, it's all around device enablement. You need a way to be able to extract data from devices and bring it back to a central source. Now, but it matters in how you do it. So you'll notice that in my diagram at the bottom, I don't just have this concept of a connect module. I have this concept of connect, monitor, and automate. And you'll notice those are duplicated in the bottom and then in the middle. And it's important for two reasons. Now, I'm going to make some enemies when I say this, but there are cases in IoT where the cloud is not viable or just not accessible. When you talk to a company that has a piece of mining equipment 5 miles under the earth, there's no way that they're going to be connected to the cloud. So how do you handle IoT in that scenario? When you talk about like that smart meter company, much to my surprise, they have very low bandwidth that they deal with, something like 100 kilobits a second. So when you've got to make decisions out in the field and you don't have, either because of intermittent connectivity or no connectivity, or situations where bandwidth is limited and the latency of going to the cloud and back causes problems, or perhaps it's just the communication costs in and of itself. I mean, I read a report that said that up to 50% of IoT implementation costs are just in the communication alone. And you can imagine imagine that if there's a lot of cellular connectivity that these things are riding on. So you need some way for that device to effectively be autonomous in a way, to be able to do its own monitoring of events and automation, whether that happens at that bottom layer on the device itself, or whether it happens back in the cloud over a whole population of devices. I'm not saying this is a one or the other situation. What I am saying is that you requires both. In many situations, especially as you start bringing together more and more different types of devices and different environments, things that don't live in the back room but actually live out there in the field, you're going to need these sorts of things. Now, of course, on the top of the stack, data analytics has its place. And I'm not talking about business intelligence. I'm talking about data analytics. And it's different. I mean, so what I'm talking about is, when you want to understand the behavior of a machine, and whether you use machine learning algorithms to do this or some other sort, it's just a different type of processing. It's a different type of discovery and learning than you would do in a typical BI application. Again, BI is all about the enterprise data, and that's important. The data analytics is more focused on the machine data, and again, bringing those together into a whole situation makes sense. So if I was to tie these two worlds together, so how do the use cases that I've sort of mentioned out there map into those components that I said on the right, this idea of connecting devices, monitoring real-time data streams off those devices, automating or orchestrating events or actions that come off of those devices, predicting things that might happen in the future, and optimization. This is an example of how that would work. So this concept of smart diagnostics, device management, condition-based maintenance. Lots of companies, I think, are really starting to look at that one. And all of those, in my mind, in a lot of cases, are things that are the money-saving options. And you'll hear people talk about, IoT deployments sort of being broken up into sort of two categories. Either they're going to help you save money or they're going to help you make money. And I think that that's true. When I go out and talk to people in the field, what I see today is a lot of people understanding the cost-saving side of things. And maybe that's because it's easier to justify to the CFO. It's very tangible. You can calculate an ROI on it. It's easy to say, well, if I could save you 2% on this, what would that really mean? But I think that the real exciting opportunities are going to be the ones that happen more on the revenue generating side. How can you unlock new services that you could provide the customers, or that product differentiation to be able to provide new things? This concept of, in some cases, it's not even that you're using IoT to manage the device itself, but in some cases, it's the application that runs on that device. An example of that would be something like telecommunications, video conferencing. Sure, those video conferencing units are important or expensive in some cases if you get the big room systems. And who hasn't been in a room where you go and you start up your video conference and you spend the first 10 minutes trying to figure out, why both sides can't connect or the camera's going the wrong way and that kind of thing. Huge support costs for those companies. So if you're able to not just detect that those problems were there before the customer even ran into that situation, but then even get to the sort of the holy grail of self-healing or self-remedy on those situations, it's amazing. And the reality is this technology exists today. The challenge is getting companies to understand how best to use it for their own purposes. So let's go through a quick deployment scenario to kind of explain what I mean. So we'll use the construction example again. So the concept here, of course, is that we'll have some sort of software running on some sort of telematics unit, potentially running on the machine itself, sending data up. Again, stressing the point here that it's not just the device data that's important. It's the other external data sources that come in, whether that's enterprise data or whether that's public data. I saw an example earlier. Someone was talking about agriculture and the things that you can do there. I mean, being able to understand not just properties of soil, but being able to understand how weather patterns affect that. So bringing in other data sources to combine with these new sensor types that are on the equipment is incredibly important. And then what if you knew all of that information, that you could sell that back to the fertilizer companies and say, well, gosh, I know in every part of the country what soil conditions are. I mean, how useful would that be for both the companies that are interested in understanding that information and the ones that hold it? So the first step is this. And so I figure like I already made an enemy of the cloud guys by saying the cloud doesn't always necessarily have to play in IoT. Now I'm going to potentially offend some BI and dashboard guys, because in a lot of early examples, this is what people are doing for IoT and they think they're done. So this is the idea of saying, I've got a piece of equipment, I'm taking data points up, I put it in a dashboard, or I put it in a database, and granted, that's can be hard work depending on what you're talking about, especially if you have to normalize the data and combine different sort of formats and sources and things. And they show it in the dashboard, and they call it actionable data. Now, a year ago, I started talking to some people about actionable data, and that's not what I meant, but I get it. The idea that this is data that wasn't available before. You've now surfaced it, you've put it somewhere, so a human could take action on it. It's actionable data. But to me, that's not enough. To me, you'll never, if you believe even just a fraction of some of the numbers out there in terms of number of connected devices and the amount of data points and things that you want to talk about, another case in point, I spoke with a company that was doing this. And they were proud of themselves, and again, they should be. But they let me into their back room, and I was able to see the fact that they were collecting data from equipment off the field. They even went the step further of doing an integration into an operational system, so when they saw a trouble event in the field, they could create a ticket and show it on the thing. And then they showed me these 4 guys sitting in front of a bunch of dashboards watching all this stuff. And I'm like, well, gosh, how does that scale? And of course, the guy came over to me and he said, it doesn't. And in fact, they're already restricting what their business wants to do, because they know they can't afford the human capital to either bring on more equipment to scale out, or more people to scale out for the equipment they have. But they also mentioned to me, we're also constrained by only watching for 20 error conditions. We really want to watch for 100 error conditions, but we know we can't do it. So while this is an important first step, this is by no far the end of it. What you want to get to, is automating data-driven actions. So, and you'll notice that I drew this in 2 different ways. So there's the part on the bottom that all lives on the device. That's the cloud doesn't always play a part in some of these situations. Although in the best ones it does, because there's rules and actions that can happen directly on the device, and there's rules and actions that can happen in the cloud. But now you're closing the loop. Now you're getting to a point where you can actually scale a solution and apply business logic in real time to that data to make instant decisions. That's what I think is missing with a lot of IoT deployments. Not to mention that analytics complete the solution. So if you were to take that IoT stack that I drew earlier and use this as effectively the plumbing about how it all fits together, this is the way that I view it. This is what I see companies needing to deploy to really realize the business value and get to those business outcomes that they really need. Now, do you need to do this all in one shot? Absolutely not. And in fact, I think that companies that do will also fall into a trap. But it's important to have a vision of where you're going to go and understand what it's going to take to get there. So then, just like in any sort of project management, you'd break this up into manageable chunks that can prove value in the short term and give you the confidence and give you the feeling that you're going to get to the outcome that you're looking for. So 3 key takeaways from the way I look at this. Things require more than just simple connectivity. So don't just look for solutions that grab data points and throw them in the cloud. You need to be able to run local logic on that device itself. Rule enforcement should be locationally fluid. The idea that rules can run in the cloud and rules can run in the device, and quite honestly, you as the business people shouldn't have to worry about that. The system should be able to understand where those data points live, where it makes most sense. In some cases, it's not a matter of moving the data to the logic. It's a matter of moving the logic to the data, and the technology exists for this to happen. And then again, dashboards don't matter. Closing the loops does. So dashboards will always have their place in running the business, but I think when you start thinking about the scalability and some of the things that are required for an IoT solution to be successful, you really need to create the automation and that round trip of the data from the device to monitoring rules and ultimately actions. So my advice moving forward is focus on business value. Hopefully I got everybody on board that the technology is an important piece and you need to do it in a way that makes sense. But if you don't understand where you're going, you'll never get there. Think big and start small. Have the wherewithal to understand a vision and a roadmap of where you want to go. I think it's okay to think big. In fact, in many cases when we go through brainstorming sessions, I like that sort of creativity of divergent thought of, what if, I think that what's interesting is a lot of times when I speak to companies out there, they self-limit themselves. They say, well, we're just going to do this. And I'm like, well, why would you just want to do that? And they're like, well, I think that that's all we can do. And I was like, well, did you realize that there are all these other possibilities? And their eyes open up and they didn't realize. So I think it's okay to think big. Just realize that at some point you need to converge back down to a reasonable set of small-term goals that can prove some business value and get you the justification you need to move on to the next step. Leverage subject matter experts. You'll find these inside your companies themselves. My point of bringing this out is, while the technology is great, the technology will only get you so far. All the machine learning in the world will never really understand how a particular machine works in a particular environment, at least not today. So my recommendation is use the tools to do the heavy lifting, get 90% of the way there or more using some of the technology, but then always make sure that smart people are reviewing that and understanding what's happened. And I think that's important. And then finally, Gartner talks about, what are some of the issues as to why IoT deployments aren't being successful today. And they said a couple of things. One of them just being the fact that most companies don't have the skills to do this themselves today. Again, they're sort of faced with, do I go to 10 different vendors and here's an analytics piece and here's a device piece and here's some rules engine and I've got a communication vendor and a cloud vendor and all these other things and somehow I'm going to stitch this all together. You don't have to go it alone. There are companies out here that have been successful in understanding these challenges and deploying it. And so in my last minute up here, I'm going to tell you about one of those companies. Happens to be the place I work for, Bsquare. So if you subscribe at all to the ideas I told you today about business first, business outcome-based ideas around IoT. My company has a product called DataV that actually maps directly to that IoT stack I mentioned. And so it's that software stack combined with professional services capabilities. We've been doing this for 20 years in the embedded space, and we've moved on, as the rest of the industry has, into user interfaces and data analytics. And so we've got what we believe is a complete software and services solution to help companies make these ideas come to life. So with that, I hope you appreciated this talk. We do have a booth out in the Expo Center, so I'll be there later today, and enjoy the show.